2014 Allan Sefton Memorial Lecture, and I'd like to start the proceedings by asking Melba Christ, the Head of the Administration for the University, our Chief Administrative Officer, to say a few words.
Thank you very much, John. I often get rolled out to do the university opening on these, so don't be surprised that I'm the Chief Administrative Officer and not actually an academic. But it's always a pleasure to come to these and to introduce and to welcome everybody, because there's such fantastic opportunities to hear about new and interesting things that are going on, or old and still interesting things that are going on. So it's fabulous that I'm very happy to be here. So before we start, I'd just like to do a very brief acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wadi people of Darrawal country. It's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Wollongong is built, and as we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within this university, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. Now I understand this is the 22nd Allan Sefton lecture, recognising the significant contribution that the late Allan Sefton made to protecting the local environment. And to have a lecture go for 22 years is a wonderful piece of the university's tradition. I'd like to welcome all the attendees that come from a broad range of origins and interests. And I'd like to make a very special welcome to the members of the Sefton family, and in particular Allan's wife, Dorothy. Welcome. The Allan Sefton Lecture is an important occasion. It's one of our major public lectures of the academic year, and it's a key part of facilitating the ongoing interaction between the University of Wollongong and the local community. And that's something that I think almost makes the university unique in Australia, is the strength of that interaction between university and community. We are, as a university, very appreciative of the support that BlueScope and Wollongong City Council provide us as sponsors, and we sincerely thank them for their ongoing support. Thank you very much. So, I hope everyone has an enjoyable evening. I can too. Thank you.
As many of you will know, we have an Allan Sefton Fund which is used to support this lecture, but we also use the fund to support the prize given to the best graduate in the environmental science program of the university. That was one of the first initiatives we had with the fund. So the prize is awarded to the best student in the 4-year Honours Environmental Science, Bachelor Environmental Science program. And I'd like to invite Dr. Sefton to present the prize this year. And the prize winner is Josh King.
You can talk to him. This is why I prepared one earlier.
It's a great honour again to be able to present the prize, of course, for the Allan Sefton Memorial. After 22 years, it's hard to say more new things, but we do appreciate, the family appreciates the honour that has been paid to the memory of Allan for the work that he did in the environment for the world. It was the early days of trying to protect the environment and the conservation movement, and they worked so hard. It was 40 years of people before he died that he had been involved in this work. And we did have some successes, but of course it's like freedom, eternal vigilance, because there's always someone trying to get something, and it's hard to preserve what you've got and to protect it. But anyway, we have students like Josh coming through who are working, and they will hopefully take their place and make a mark in the preservation
Thanks very much, Dorothy. As you heard at the beginning, one of our sponsors is the Wollongong City Council, and I'd like to call upon our Mayor, Councillor Gordon Bradley, to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very significant occasion. Before I go any further, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather and pay my respects to elders past and present. We're very fortunate inasmuch that we have a legacy and an example of an individual who fought for the environment and left us much to reflect upon, even 21 years later. And it is also, as I look back over those 21 years, being reminded of significant and capable individuals who have delivered this lecture. And we're very fortunate to have one such person with us tonight. Also, let me just add that Wollongong City Council, even though we might not necessarily fulfil all the requirements and expectations at times, and I won't use the language that has been recorded in the Mercury about what I used or quoted in describing Wollongong City councillors, but even though we might be a paper such and such, we do have a passion for the environment, and we're very fortunate in as much that we have two very passionate Greens councillors, but also the rest of the councillors are keen on protecting and facilitating and making sure the city's environment is maintained and cared for. But it's also been one of the directives of the community itself, in as much that the 2022 Vision Community Strategic Plan identified as the community goal that we value and protect our environment. And amongst those statements that were under that particular goal is that the natural environment is to be protected and enhanced. Our coastal areas and waterways are protected and managed. Wollongong's ecological footprint is to be reduced. The community's awareness and appreciation of heritage is increased. Local food production and community food initiatives are supported. The sustainability of our urban environment to be improved. These were some of the themes that the community obviously identified, and for a strategic vision under this community strategic plan, that is the environment has taken priority. Usually it's roads, footpaths, buildings, structures, and all that physical amenity. But it's good to see that the community has clearly identified what it seeks, and that is a better environment, and more specifically, the protection and the facilitation of the natural environment. So tonight we're very fortunate to have with us Becky Clark, who is the CEO of the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales. And you're here not to listen to me, but to listen to him. So everyone, I'd like you to put your hands together and make him feel welcome. Becky Clark.
Thank you and good evening. I believe my microphone is on. No, it's not. There we go. Is that better? Testing. We'll figure it out. All right. Sorry about that. Well, thank you. It's a real honour to be invited to speak to you this evening. I'd particularly like to acknowledge and thank Dorothy. It's a real pleasure to meet you, and to the University of Wollongong for inviting me to be here this evening. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this country, the Wadi-Wadi people of the Darug Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. It's an absolute honour to be invited to present this memorial lecture in honour of the life and achievements of Mr. Allan Sefton. Like many of you, I never had the opportunity to meet Allan, but his life's work has left a lasting legacy in the hearts and minds of his friends and family, in his words and images, and perhaps most importantly of all, in the landscape around us. Allan was an energetic and effective advocate for nature conservation in the Illawarra. His life's work provides a lasting source of inspiration and a powerful reminder of the capacity of committed individuals to make the world a better place. Allan's lifetime commitment to conservation forms part of a rich tradition of environmental advocacy here in the Illawarra. For more than a century, conservationists have worked to safeguard the unique natural diversity and scenic beauty of this region, building enduring public support for protection of the area's environmental values. Like many conservationists, Allan's efforts to protect the natural world were undertaken on a voluntary basis. This tradition is alive and well today. My own organisation, the Nature Conservation Council, represents over 120 community organisations from across the state and more than 60,000 individual members of those organisations, many of whom give their time voluntarily for the environment and for their local community. It's an honour and a privilege to have the opportunity to represent that vibrant community of committed individuals who, like Allan Sefton, have devoted their lives to safeguarding the diversity and beauty of the natural world. In his working life, Allan was employed by the BHP Steelworks at Port Kembla. Following his death in 1989, the company made a generous gift to the university, commemorating his life's work by establishing the Allan Sefton Award and this memorial lecture series. When I was invited to present this lecture, I was struck by Allan's twin roles as a steel worker and a conservationist, and the parallels with the history and heritage of the Illawarra region. The Illawarra has a strong heritage of industrial development, founded on the presence of large accessible coal reserves and a deep water port suitable for importing iron ore and exporting coal and steel products. For many years, industrial development has shaped the identity of Wollongong and the surrounding area. Over the past century, coal mines and steelworks have made a substantial contribution to the social and economic fabric of the region. But this development has not come without its costs. The rapid expansion of the coal industry in recent decades in this region and across New South Wales has led to increasing controversy over the impacts of coal mining on natural areas and water resources and the industry's contribution to global climate change. In this lecture, I propose to trace the intertwined threads of conservation and coal mining in the Illawarra, to examine the escalated conflict between conservation and coal mining, not just here, but across Australia, and present options for a more sustainable future based on clean, renewable energy and strong protections for our land, water and wildlife. In preparing for this lecture, I had the opportunity to read the inaugural Allan Sefton lecture, presented in 1993 by Dr. Harry Rescher of the University of New England. In his lecture, Dr. Rescher outlined the actions and policies that he believed were required to protect and restore Australia's biological resources. In introducing his lecture, he said, "To many, these changes may appear radical and uncompromising, naive and politically impossible. I recognise all these things, but I also recognise the need for change. 20 years later, we too must recognise the need for change. The evidence of climate change is too stark, the level of community concern about mining impacts too high for us to persist in the complacent belief that the coal industry will survive the 21st century. Change is inevitable, but it is our choices that will determine the nature of that change. We can and must, now and in the future, take bold action to secure a safe, prosperous future for the Illawarra based on innovation, education and an enduring commitment to environmental sustainability." As you'll know from the outline of this evening's lecture, I'm proposing to cover a fairly broad canvas this evening. I hope you'll hang in there as we pass over historical esoterica, solar photovoltaics and everything else in between. But it starts a very long time ago. For thousands of years, the Dharawal people lived on this land, actively managing the surrounding landscape through the use of fire and harvesting the rich marine resources found along the Illawarra coast. Their history lives on in the language and traditions of the Dharawal people and in the tangible cultural heritage of the region. Middens, rock carvings and ancient paintings are reminders of rich human history of this area and the continuing connection of the Dharawal people to this country. From the early years of European settlement, naturalists took a keen interest in the living heritage of the Illawarra, documenting the diverse range of plants, animals and landforms. And over time, the settlers came to value the region as a place of recreation, and a refuge from the increasingly crowded settlement of Sydney Cove. In the second half of the 19th century, proposals were developed for a large park to provide opportunities for healthy outdoor recreation by residents of Sydney and Wollongong. The establishment of Royal National Park in 1879 marked a key milestone in the history of nature conservation in Australia and around the world. Royal National Park, or the National Park as it was then called, was the first reserve in the world formally designated as a national park. The park, which originally covered around 7,000 hectares, was declared in April 1879, 135 years ago. In November of that year, a few months after the declaration of the park, a visiting journalist from the Sydney Morning Herald wrote, "To a lover of nature in its wildest form, nothing more beautiful can be conceived than the scene which met the gaze of visitors when they arrived at the bottom of the gully. In all directions were huge cabbage palms, some almost as much as 80 feet in height, with bright green foliage. The timber, which consisted of blackbark, turpentine, she-oak, banana, and species of eucalypti, were all on a gigantic scale, and the undergrowth so luxurious as to be impenetrable in places. Clearly, this natural place made an impression, both as a place of recreation, but also an area of extraordinary natural beauty. For those of you who have been avidly following the recent Royal tour, you might be interested to know that the prefix Royal was added to the National Park after Queen Elizabeth II passed by in a train on her way from Wollongong in 1955. While the park was principally declared as an area for public recreation, it was clear that there was a recognition of its natural values from a very early stage. In 1893, the guidebook to the park stressed the importance of conserving the natural vegetation, stating somewhat grandly that the primeval forests will remain untouched. No woodman's axe is permitted to lay low the lordly forest trees, which are to be allowed to bring forth their springtime buds and shed their withered leaves for so long as the trees stand and the roots hold fast. The whole heritage is safe beyond the reach of plunder, safe from the machinations of ambitious schemers, and secured to the people of this country upon express terms fixed and made final by Act of Parliament." They were wonderful sentiments. It turned out that the Trust of the Park did allow logging on a few periods inside the National Park, but it was the last of those occasions, which is actually interesting because it's one of the very early conflicts between conservation and coal industry in Australia, and contributed to the emergence of one of our very first wildlife preservation organisations. In 1920, the trustees of the park granted the Metropolitan Coal Company the right to harvest timber over an area of about 500 hectares inside the National Park. That came to the attention of the public and was at odds with a growing appreciation of the need for nature conservation. So it gave rise to one of Australia's, and possibly Australia's, first conservation battle. The Wildlife Preservation Society, which was founded in 1909, spearheaded a campaign led by David Stead to protect the area and end logging inside the National Park. They had the support of the Sydney Morning Herald, which published an article in 1922 describing the trustees as vandals and calling for the immediate cancellation of the logging contracts. The campaign ultimately led to the end of logging within the park and provided a model for future conservation campaigns. But the reason for the logging was to harvest timber to provide struts for the coal mine, the tunnels of the coal mine. So it's interesting that right from the very early days of the modern conservation movement in Australia, and particularly in the Illawarra, there was this tension between the industrial development and heritage of the area and the way that people were making a living and an emerging conservation ethic. Interestingly, when the park was first declared, there was no formal legal barrier to mining within park boundaries. It took more than a century before the park received clear legal protection from mining. Over that period, the Trust of the Park considered a succession of proposals to permit mining, and over time progressively developed a clear position in opposition to mining within the park boundaries. In 1965, it responded to yet another prospecting application by advising the Department of Mines that whilst the needs of the mining companies may be pressing, those needs are of little importance compared with the task of preserving areas set aside for conservation and public recreation. The present Trust has resisted successfully past attempts to mine for mineral, beach sands, thin out timber, remove gravel, and the Trust will continue to exercise its statutory authority, especially to protect the Royal National Park as part of our common heritage. Today, Royal National Park receives a high level of protection under the National Parks and Wildlife Act, which sets out management principles and clear, binding legal protections for more than 800 national parks across New South Wales. From humble beginnings right here in the Illawarra, the National Parks movement has prospered and grown to a worldwide phenomenon. There were, of course, parallel developments in the United States. Yellowstone, which later went on to be declared a national park, was gazetted just a few years before our Royal National Park here. But right around the world, governments have founded national parks agencies to establish and manage national parks for nature conservation and public recreation. For more than a century, passionate conservation advocates have maintained momentum, building lasting community and government support for the establishment and management of national parks. From one national park, covering about 7,000 hectares right here in the Illawarra, Australia now has more than 10,000 terrestrial protected areas, covering more than 118 million hectares, or more than 15% of the Australian landmass. These are the modern day boundaries of the Royal National Park, and you can see that over time they've been joined by very large reserves in the Blue Mountains, Wollongong and Natai wilderness and World Heritage areas. Many of those areas were protected as a result of the advocacy of conservationists like Miles and Marla Dunphy. Miles Dunphy gained much of his first exposure to wild nature in the Royal National Park. So there's an unbroken chain of history and advocacy for the protection of natural areas that has its origins just down the road from where we stand this evening. Across Australia, that's now grown, as I said, to tens of millions of hectares. And globally, there are now more than 120,000 protected areas, covering more than 12% of the Earth's land surface. Protected areas play a keystone role in national and international conservation efforts by protecting habitat and providing a safe haven for native plants and animals. The people of the Illawarra can be extremely proud of their role in the global conservation history. The establishment of Royal National Park marked an enormously important milestone in the evolution of protected area policy and practice, and the results are visible to us right across the world. Many of these areas now protect some of the world's most iconic natural places, from the Grand Canyon to Kakadu. In addition to its place in conservation history, Royal National Park is also an extraordinary place in its own right. And in 2010, local conservationists, including the Sutherland Shire Environment Centre, launched a campaign to achieve World Heritage listing of the Royal National Park in recognition of its unique natural values and its historical significance. Last year, the New South Wales Government announced that it will be seeking federal government support for a World Heritage nomination of the area, including Royal National Park, Heathcote National Park and the Garrawarra State Conservation Area. The state government's proposal does require federal government support before a formal nomination can be submitted to the World Heritage Commission, which is the international body responsible for inscription of World Heritage properties. The proposal to nominate this park for World Heritage listing is a testament to the vision and dedication of local conservationists who've so effectively documented and promoted the rich cultural and natural heritage of this area. So it's clear that this region has a rich and unique heritage of conservation advocacy, and Allan Sefton's work forms an important part of that legacy. But in parallel with its pioneering role in nature conservation, the Illawarra also occupies a prominent place in the history of coal mining in Australia. Following the discovery of coal deposits near Newcastle in 1791, coal mining operations were established at the mouth of the Hunter River to provide coal for local sale and later export. In 1804, Governor King established a particularly harsh penal colony for recalcitrant convicts to mine the coal. Coal was initially used for domestic heating and small steam and gas plants. By 1814, the surplus of coal eventually led to the export of 154 tonnes to Bengal, India, which was paid for with rum, strangely enough. In the 200 years since that particular shipment, the New South Wales coal industry has grown into a large, highly productive industry that mines more than 200 million tonnes of coal each year, and approximately 80% of that produced for export. The New South Wales and Queensland coal industries have expanded to the point that the combined output from both states has made Australia the largest exporter of coal in the world. That coal is, the largest port, of course, is Newcastle, with Port Kembla in second place. From humble beginnings, the Australian coal industry has become a global player. A global player not only in the coal industry and mining industry, but also in a high-stakes debate about the future of energy generation in a world threatened by climate change. Closer to home, the increasing scale, extent and intensity of mining operations, not only in the Illawarra, but right across New South Wales and also my home state of Queensland, has created increasing public controversy about the impacts of coal mining on land, water, important environmental values and local communities. I'd like to explore some of those conflicts between coal and conservation, starting right here in the Illawarra with the question of mining and drinking water catchments. I'm originally from central Queensland. My first exposure to the mining industry was in my childhood when a mining company proposed to mine the ancient sand dunes that provided clean, fresh water for our town. Our community strongly opposed the proposal. It was a hard-fought battle, but we ultimately prevailed. And that water catchment area today remains intact, providing clean, fresh water year after year, even in times of drought. Right across Australia, our towns and cities rely on healthy natural catchments and aquifers to provide drinking water and water for other uses. In New South Wales, natural forested areas provide clean, fresh water for the overwhelming majority of the population of the state. Wollongong sources most of its water from the Upper Nepean catchment. The Upper Nepean catchment covers almost 900 square kilometres of mostly pristine bushland on the Illawarra Plateau. Its tall forests, swamps and rainforests are home to many rare and threatened species, including the white waratah. Like the Wollongong pine, the exact location of the white waratah, which was discovered in the 1960s, is kept a secret to protect the plants. Most of the Upper Nepean catchment area, which provides Wollongong's drinking water supply, is protected within the Metropolitan Special Area. The Metropolitan Special Area was declared in 1880 to provide protection for both the quality and quantity of water being supplied to Sydney and to Wollongong. Special areas were later declared in O'Hare's Creek, Warranora, Warragamba, Shoalhaven, Fitzroy Falls, Winter Caribbean, the Blue Mountains and Prospect catchments. Together, these special areas cover about 3,700 square kilometres. That's an area 1.5 times the size of the Australian Capital Territory. They provide essential protection for drinking water supplies for both Wollongong and Sydney. And the special areas are intended to provide protection from pollution and disturbance. The penalties for unauthorised entry into these areas are severe. Individuals who enter into the designated catchment areas face fines of many thousands of dollars simply for being present in the area without the permission of the Sydney Catchment Authority. Given the high level of protection afforded to these areas to protect our drinking water supply, it seems strange to allow mining operations in these special areas. But that is precisely what the New South Wales government has permitted for more than 50 years. 4 underground coal mines currently operating in Sydney's drinking water catchments, progressively undermining the streams, rivulets and delicate upland swamps that feed our water supply dams. The Sydney Catchment Authority has estimated that the existing longwall mining operations in our special catchment areas drain as much as 3 billion litres of water per year from the catchment due to the fracturing of the bedrock and stream beds. Mining also releases from the rock iron, manganese and other contaminants into the streams that flow into our water supply. The impacts of coal mining in our water catchments are cumulative and intensifying. Cracking of stream beds and bedrock associated with mine subsidence persists over time, leading to an accumulation of harm, a cumulative loss of water and damage to freshwater ecosystems, including the delicate upland swamps that provide fresh water, particularly at times of drought. More than the increasing scale of mining operations, accompanied by massive increases in the width of underground longwall panels, is leading to more severe impacts on and beneath the surface, exacerbating the existing legacy of damage in our catchments. More than 4.5 million people, rather, 4.5 million, underwhelming. Many more than 4.5 people, in fact 4.5 million people, rely on these special catchment areas for their water supply, including you and I. Those of us who live in Wollongong and Sydney depend on these areas for our water. The desalination plant provides some supplementary supply in periods of low rainfall, but the reality is that we continue to remain first and foremost on these remarkable natural areas, which were set aside many years ago to provide a clean, reliable source of water for the city. Ongoing population growth, together with the rainfall and temperature changes associated with climate change, will place increasing pressure on urban water supplies. It defies common sense to jeopardise these permanent assets for short-term profit. Barry O'Farrell, the recently former Premier, recognised this basic fact when he promised, hand on heart, to ban mining and drinking water catchments across New South Wales. 3 years on from the state election, that promise remains unfulfilled by the current government. The Wallara 2 mine on the Central Coast, which prompted Barry O'Farrell's promise to the public, continues to sail unimpeded through the planning system. This stark breach of faith with the people of New South Wales is symptomatic of the enormous influence that the mining industry has on our democracy in New South Wales. Polling conducted by Essential Research last year found that 87% of people support banning coal and coal seam gas activities in drinking water catchments, but the state government continues to resist reform. The public officials responsible for the declaration of the Metropolitan Special Area more than 130 years ago demonstrated foresight and vision, anticipating our needs and providing protection for one of the essentials of life, fresh, clean water. It's time for our current elected leaders to exercise similar foresight by ending the expansion of mining operations in drinking water catchments across New South Wales, including right here in the Illawarra. I'd just like to turn now to a slightly broader canvas and the impacts of coal mining on natural areas. The rapid expansion of coal and coal seam gas development in New South Wales has generated increasing controversy and conflict in recent years. The impacts of mining and gas on our land and water are becoming increasingly prominent. Not a day goes by when there are not reports in the media about mining or coal seam gas proposals, the reaction of the community to those proposals, and the role of industry and lobbyists in shaping the policy environment that regulates these activities. The impacts of mining and gas development extend to our public lands and natural areas. Our analysis has found that more than half of our state forests and 2/3 of our state conservation areas are covered by mining and exploration titles for either the mining or the coal seam gas industry. The impacts of mining on our public lands were graphically illustrated by the damage to the Sugarloaf State Conservation Area on the Central Coast last year. In the northwest of our state, right now, bulldozers are rolling through the Pilliga State Forest, carving lines for pipelines and coal seam gas development, set to transform that forest into an industrial gas field covering up to 85,000 hectares. In Laird Forest, construction of expansion of the Whitehaven and Boggabri coal mines is permanently destroying some of the best wildlife habitat in that region and compromising groundwater supplies in the area. I've had the opportunity to visit Laird Forest and Pilliga to see firsthand the impacts of this type of development. And I can say to you that this is not the future that I wish to see for our public lands and natural areas. These are our public lands, the common heritage of the people of New South Wales. We did not and will not give our consent to their destruction. The Nature Conservation Council, together with a broad alliance of community organisations, is calling for the immediate protection of sensitive environmental areas, drinking water catchments, and our most productive farmland from mining and gas development. But there is a longer-term question that we must face. What is the place of coal in a world threatened by climate change? Will the coal industry survive the 21st century? And if not, what steps must we make to prosper as a nation, a state, and a region in an increasingly carbon-constrained world? The evidence is clear. By burning fossil fuels and destroying forests, we have disrupted the balance of the Earth's atmosphere, leading to changes in the global climate. The predicted impact of these changes on people and nature are serious and far-reaching. Urgent action is required to reduce global carbon emissions. In the absence of a strong international response to climate change, countries around the world, including our own, face devastating environmental, social and economic impacts in coming decades. In Australia, achieving deep cuts in our domestic carbon emissions will require a range of strategies, including protecting our carbon-rich native forests, controlling land clearing, improving industrial efficiency, and perhaps most importantly, making a transition away from fossil fuels. Burning of fossil fuels is the single largest contributor to global climate change. National and international scientific institutions have warned that proven fossil fuel reserves contain many times more carbon dioxide than we can afford to burn. In this context, it is time to reassess the costs and benefits of Australia's coal industry. Our coal exports contribute to global carbon emissions by reducing the cost of coal relative to lower emission energy sources. Recall that Australia is the largest exporter of coal in the world. We're not the largest producer, but we are the nation that exports the largest amount of coal. And in that respect, we have a keystone role in international coal markets. In New South Wales, 90% of our electricity is produced by polluting coal-fired power stations. Over the past few years, emissions from the electricity sector have actually declined. This is a piece of good news. There's been a reduction in demand, in part due to a downturn in some forms of industrial activity, also increased energy efficiency and a response to increasing power prices. But there's also been a shifting of energy sources. There's increased hydroelectric generation from the Snowy scheme as a result of higher rainfall. But we've also seen a rapid increase in other forms of renewable energy, and perhaps most notably, an exponential growth in the use of rooftop solar, a sustained decline in the cost of solar photovoltaics, combined with increasing power prices, has seen the number of rooftop solar panels go through the roof. We've now got more than 1 million households in Australia, approximately 2.3 million people who have made the switch to solar, and collectively they're generating in excess of 3,000 megawatts of energy from the sun falling on their roof. In New South Wales, over the past few years, the number of coal-fired power stations have reduced their production and therefore their pollution. Wallerawang Power Station has suspended operations, and Munmora Power Station is permanently closed. So we are starting to see some early signs of change, some of the green shoots of a cleaner energy economy. Much more remains to be done, but there are promising signs of change in the electricity sector. This change needs to be accelerated, and a key element of achieving that change is very much about the government policy. Maintaining and strengthening effective carbon price is an essential part of that policy environment. But while there are some encouraging signs in the electricity sector, overall our carbon emissions have not fallen. One of the key contributing factors to that is a rapid increase in emissions from the mining sector. Fugitive emissions from coal mining have increased rapidly, keeping pace with the expansion of that industry overall. Since 1990, emissions from the mining sector as a whole, since 1990, emissions from the mining sector as the whole have increased by more than 80%, driven principally by emissions from coal mining. That dotted line, which starts at 0% in 1990, this is a graph of percentage change in carbon emissions, or greenhouse gas emissions rather, by economic sector from 1990 to 2012. The fine dotted line is the mining sector. So you can see that in that period from 1990 to 2012, emissions from the mining sector have increased by more than 80%, and that continues to grow. So while there are other parts of the economy that are reducing their emissions, the mining sector, by virtue of its rapid expansion overall, has dramatically increased its contributions to our country's domestic emissions. There are also significant questions surrounding the modelling and monitoring of carbon emissions from coal seam gas operations, in particular fugitive emissions of methane. That's an area that remains unsettled in terms of government policy and science, but it's certainly possible that the methane emissions from coal seam gas will have a significantly greater impact than anticipated by the economists. So the mining sector, and coal in particular, is one of the key sources of growth in carbon emissions nationally, and also particularly here in New South Wales and in Queensland. Combined with emissions from Australian coal burnt overseas, it's clear that the coal industry must be a top priority for climate reform. So what are the priorities for reform? In the view of the Nature Conservation Council, there are a number of priorities for action on climate change, including improvements, major, large-scale improvements in industrial, commercial and residential energy efficiency. The cheapest power is the power that we never use. Also, rapid and large-scale investment, both private and public, in proven clean energy sources like wind and solar. And also, supported by those previous two changes, the progressive closure of coal-fired power stations. We cannot kid ourselves. If we're going to reduce carbon emissions, then coal-fired power stations need to start closing down at a rate of knots. Now, the onus is on us to ensure that the innovation, investment and forward planning is in place to meet the energy needs of our communities. But the fact remains that unless we start closing coal-fired power stations soon, we will not meet any kind of scientifically credible emission reduction targets. The New South Wales Nature Conservation Council is opposed to the expansion of further mining of thermal coal due to its impact on climate, natural environment and local communities. I think it's probably useful at this stage to reflect for a moment on the place of steel manufacturing in a carbon-constrained world. Given the industrial heritage and history of the Illawarra region, it is a key question. What do these changes in our economy and policy environment mean for the manufacturing of steel? There's no doubt that strong climate change policy has the potential to have an impact on the regulatory and economic environment of the steel industry. But there are opportunities for the steel industry to get ahead of the game by continuing to invest in low carbon manufacturing technology to bring down the carbon footprint of steel manufacturing. Across the economy, to reduce the emissions associated with these materials by increasing dramatically the recovery and recycling of iron and steel products. And also, I think importantly, given the current concerns, the growing concerns about the impacts of mining on natural areas and water resources, it's essential to that the steelmaking industry takes action to phase out the use of raw materials, both coking coal and iron ore, from areas that are essential for water supply and nature conservation. It's a responsibility that flows through the supply chain that cannot be avoided. So what about the economic impacts of this type of change? Is this change radical, impossible, economically destructive? These questions are particularly pertinent for parts of the country like the Hunter Valley and the Illawarra, where coal mining has been a long part of the social and economic fabric of the region. But I think it's useful here to take a look at the evidence, to take a look at the figures. In 2011, the Australia Institute conducted a survey of about 1,300 people to examine public perceptions of the mining industry. This was the mining industry as a whole, but given the prominent place of the coal industry in the sector, I think we can draw some conclusions about the coal industry in particular. But this survey related to the mining industry as a whole. And the survey results show that the beliefs that many Australians have about the mining industry diverge radically from the facts. When asked what percentage of workers were employed in the mining industry, the average response was around 16%. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the actual figure is 1.9%. In the Illawarra, I believe the figure is slightly higher at around 2.4 or 2.5%, although that has varied dramatically in recent decades due to global market dynamics rather than environmental regulation. So the first column that you see here in the graph represents the average perceived employment in the mining industry at around 16%, and the dark bar, the second bar, is the actual figure, which nationally for the mining sector as a whole is 1.9%. The figure for the coal industry, which is a subsector, is clearly significantly lower than that. While the mining industry accounts for around 9.2% of GDP, about the same contribution as manufacturing and slightly smaller than the finance industry, a typical Australian believes that mining accounts for more than 1/3 of economic activity. You can see this represented in the graph. The white bar is the perception of the size of the mining sector as a percentage of GDP, and the black bar is the actual figure. On average, respondents said that 53% of Australian mining activity is controlled by foreign companies, where in reality the figure is actually 83%. Now, a question around domestic or foreign ownership of mining companies isn't simply a display of nationalistic fervour. It has a direct bearing on the contribution that the dividends or share price increases from the sector make here in Australia and in the regions where the mining activity takes place. But to sum up on this survey, Australians believe that the mining sector employs 9 times more workers than it actually does, accounts for 3 times as much economic activity as it really does, and is 30% more Australian owned than it actually is. It's true that the mining boom created new jobs in mining, higher wages for those in the mining industry, and high dividends and share price gains for shareholders. But the benefits of the mining industry are a mixed blessing for the economy overall. Strong world demand for Australian minerals and for coal has driven up the exchange rate, the value of the Australian dollar, which in turn has reduced world demand for our manufactured goods and agricultural goods, as well as for our tourism and education export services, which are very large sectors of the economy, significant drivers of economic activity. For a region like the Illawarra, with a large and diversified local economy, where mining accounts for around 2.4% of the workforce, the costs of protecting our natural areas, our water catchments, and making a transition to clean energy sources are not as large as many may assume. And indeed, given the strong industrial heritage of this region and its capacity for innovation, the region is well placed to contribute to solutions to climate change and to benefit from investment in a clean energy economy. I had an opportunity a couple of years ago to visit this campus as a part of a roadshow that we were conducting in regional centres right across New South Wales, to share examples of businesses and individuals and public institutions, including this university, that were making the switch to clean, renewable energy. And what we saw was that right across the state, a lot of people were just getting on with it. They had seen the increase in power prices from conventional power generators and the opportunities associated with making a switch to energy from the sun or wind. One lasting impression that I was left with from the forum that we held here in Wollongong was the enormous capacity for innovation, the research institutions, the industrial investment in research on things like thin film solar technology, but also the willingness of key stakeholders like the South Coast Labour Council to roll up their sleeves and start to ask some serious questions about what it looks like to reinvent the industrial economy of Wollongong and what it looks like to be at the leading edge of innovation. So I believe that this region has a unique opportunity to capitalise on its industrial heritage and its capacity for innovation, to be at the forefront of this transition to a clean energy economy. This is not something which we need fear. This is not about the lights going out. This is about a new chapter in the history of this region and our nation. There are also opportunities to capitalise on the rich conservation heritage of this region. A successful World Heritage nomination for Royal National Park would be a great boost for tourism to the area and also help to put that important conservation history, which Allan Sefton is such an important part of, on the map for Australia and indeed the world. There are also opportunities for investment in large-scale conservation programs like the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative, which is active in the Illawarra region. The Great Eastern Ranges Initiative seeks to protect, manage and restore wildlife habitat right along the Great Dividing Range, protecting some of the best parts of that area and working with landholders and local community organisations to restore the broken links in between those remaining areas of wildlife habitat. In conclusion, I would say that Wollongong and the Illawarra have been a centre of innovation in both industry and conservation. It is no small thing that this region was the birthplace of a global movement for the establishment of national parks. As the region looks to the future, it is this spirit of innovation that will ensure that the region prospers in a time of global change and carves out a truly sustainable future for the area. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here this evening. I'm very happy to take questions and thank you once again.
Indicated he's willing to answer questions if anybody has them. We just use the microphone. Anybody has a question?
I don't know how much rum they paid for answering but
Thank you for your talk. It was really great. It was really great. I really enjoyed the way that you've actually given a very strong background to the region and you've been able to tie in all of these conservation issues that are at a global scale. You've been able to bring that really home to the people that are in this area, particularly at a community level. I was a bit curious in one of the figures that you showed though, because you spoke a lot about how there's been a shift in the way people are, I suppose, sourcing their energy. You've talked about a shift, how they've moved away from coal-fired power stations, which generated a lot of energy, but we've had a lot of negative emissions. Then you spoke about the coal seam gas emissions that are coming through as well. But in the graph you showed that there was an increase in mining emissions, but a decrease in electricity, gas and water. And I'm wondering how in these sorts of reviews you actually unpack the fact that gas is actually coming from a mining source. I can see this is from an emissions point, but how do you evaluate the difference? Because if you average those to that point, they'd actually come back down to a little area.
That's a very interesting question. So the question was about the relative increase in the in the mining sector. And then the second line from the top, which is marked as electricity, gas and water in terms of percentage change since 1990. Now, it's an interesting question. This information comes from the most recent sectoral analysis from the Australian Greenhouse National Reporting System. I must admit, that particular clustering of electricity, gas and water, I suspect that that doesn't include the downstream emissions associated with the production of the gas in the first place. I expect that petroleum and gas production activities are captured in the broader mining sector. I'm afraid I don't actually know the answer, but my understanding is that the reduction, the recent reduction in that electricity, gas and water sector has been principally driven by a reduction in coal-fired power generation. That's my understanding. There are certainly other figures in that report. If you're interested, we can certainly take a look afterwards. The magnitude of the change over the past few years in that dark blue line is consistent with the percentage reduction in emissions from the electricity sector. So I think it's most likely that is principally attributable to a reduction in coal-fired power generation. Another way of looking at that, of course, is that both at the federal policy level and right through to the micro scale of people putting solar on their roofs, we're achieving some gains in that sector on that dark blue line, particularly around electricity generation, but those changes are being almost entirely undone by the increase in emissions from the mining sector. So it's another way of looking at it really, is that we've gone through an awful lot of public debate and a lot of people have rolled up their sleeves to do things to try and improve the situation. But all of the public debate, federal policy developments and individual action are being undermined by an increase in emissions in the mining sector. I should point out though that this graph is about percentage change, and so you shouldn't conclude that the increase in mining emissions is necessarily equal to the absolute amount of the reduction in coal-fired power generation. So it's a bit of a tricky graph in that respect.
I don't know. Could you comment heavily about the projected world demand for thermal coal?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There are, it's certainly a hotly debated topic, and while it's one that I follow, it's not one that I pretend to be an expert in. There's a difference in the projections in terms of the amount of thermal coal that is likely to be produced and consumed as compared with the demand for export coal from Australia. The reason I say that is that China, along with many of the other large economies, has substantial domestic reserves of coal, and so it has the capacity to ramp up its own production of coal. That, combined with recent policy announcements by the Chinese government in terms of its energy policy, suggests that there may be a significant downturn in global demand for coal, and specifically for export coal from Australia. Now, it's not an area where I pretend to be an expert, but it's certainly something that's generating significant discussion in coal and climate policy circles. So there are many who predict that the mid-term outlook for coal and coal exports from Australia is poor and is likely to deteriorate faster than many in the industry would like.
Mr. Clark, basically that's the story that you just told us is old hat. Have you got any prediction of what will happen in the future, for example, with fracking? Anything that burns produces CO2 pollution. Now, Australian economy is all about jobs, about progress. What about pollution in the future?
Okay, that's a good question. So the coal seam gas industry has expanded very rapidly in Australia, mostly in Queensland. In terms of pollution impacts from that industry, the pollution impacts range from the point of production through to the point where the gas is ultimately used. At the point of production, there's widespread concern about the potential risks of coal seam gas extraction or unconventional gas more generally on water resources, particularly groundwater resources. In New South Wales, the most significant coal seam gas developments are currently in Camden, in southwest Sydney, and in the Pilliga Forest. In the Pilliga Forest, we've seen multiple examples of multiple pollution incidents associated with principally associated with produced water that's pumped out of the deep coal seam gas seams. A fully fledged coal seam gas field can produce many millions of litres of contaminated water from the deep coal seams. They're contaminated with hydrocarbons, heavy metals, and in some cases, and famously in the case of the Pilliga, low levels of uranium contamination. So the produced water creates a very large water management problem that the industry needs to come to grips with. The dispersed nature of coal seam gas fields means that they're inherently difficult to regulate and also create some difficulties in terms of monitoring potential pollution incidents. Once the wells are up and running, many of them operate more or less on autopilot. So once you start building gas fields on the scale that's proposed in Queensland, tens of thousands of wells, I think 30, 40, 50,000 wells, or the scale that you have in North America, then you have a significant pollution risk across the landscape, particularly groundwater, but also surface water. So water pollution tends to be the principal known risk associated with coal seam gas production. The other key pollution risk at the site is the leakage of methane. Now, there are existing methodologies in place to measure leakage of methane from the wells themselves and the pipelines. Whether those are robust or not is another question. They were developed by the industry and used by the Australian federal government without verification. But there's a broader question that's arisen in Queensland as a result of research done by university academics, I believe Southern Cross University, that there may actually be much larger than anticipated fugitive emissions of methane basically coming up through the ground. Now that science is still subject to peer review. There's a lot of work to be done there. But if those preliminary findings are accurate, then it may be there are actually very large volumes of methane from coal seam gas fields, unconventional gas fields in Australia, North America and elsewhere that may be significant and complicated efforts to reduce our carbon emissions. If you combine that with the emissions associated with extracting, transporting, processing, and in the case of export, compressing the gas, and then burning it to generate electricity, the benefits when compared with coal are less clear-cut. It's still, in most cases, likely to be a lower emission source, but not by such a large amount that it presents as a credible transition fuel for a world that needs to deal with climate change. So I hope that was fairly long-winded, but I hope that addressed your...
One final question, because I really don't get it. That business, would that be mostly foreign owned, or would that monies that would be generated by fracking, by the extraction of gases, would that benefit Australia? On the majority or the minority?
So it varies, as those who've been following some of the media coverage on this over the last month or so know. Some coal seam gas outfits are very homegrown affairs. They're one person with a post office box who's basically trying their luck on a speculative exploration licence that they hope to then on-sell later. So there are a number of exploration licences that have been cancelled in recent weeks simply because the people holding the licences were not credible applicants. So there are some very homegrown affairs, but like the mining industry, the coal seam gas industry has a very high proportion of foreign ownership. So a lot of the benefits will go overseas. In terms of the production of gas, one thing that's been attracting a lot of attention also at the last few months is this question of predicted increases in gas price. So it's anticipated that gas prices will rise dramatically over the course of the next 5 years or so. Now, the coal seam gas industry would have you believe that that's because people like me are standing in the way of progress by trying to stop them developing gas resources here in New South Wales. It may come as no surprise to you to learn that that's not entirely true. The principal cause of the price increases will be that when the Queensland gas export hubs come online, the gas industry will then be able to sell gas off the Australian market to the highest bidder. And right now, the highest bidders in the world are in East Asia, and the export parity price for gas, that is the price that they can charge at the point where it leaves Gladstone Harbour, is significantly higher than current domestic prices, on some figures perhaps 3 times higher. So what we have is a situation where the gas is produced here, a very large proportion of profits go overseas. There is local employment generated, but the gas industry is generally a very small employer. It doesn't actually take that many people to operate a gas field. And then the gas itself goes off overseas, while we, both residential consumers and Australian manufacturers, will pay dramatically higher gas prices, all while the gas industry tries to blame those who are simply trying to protect land, water and natural areas. So we live in interesting times.
Debbie's quite happy to stay on afterwards and have informal discussions with anybody that wants. I'd just like to try and round up the ceremony tonight with the formal final act, which is Paul Wright, the Environment Manager for Resource and Climate Change Political.
So, firstly, thank you, Pippi. I guess in the tradition of the Allan Sefton Memorial Lectures, it was both consistent with the level of interest and also the information that's been presented. It's been very consistent over the years. Dorothy would agree that the level of information that we get out of these lectures is fantastic. But also Allan, I guess, in a number of ways. Last year's presentation on the Great Barrier Reef was a great concern, and the common theme between the last 2 years is around individual responsibility and community responsibility to be able to protect the environment, because largely there's a lot of other interests, a lot of other stakeholders. One of the challenges John gives me when I get up here is to be able to summarise and pick some key points. And despite all the training that this university has given me over the years, I've ended up with a hell of a lot of big points from your lecture, which I guess reflects the quality of the lecture you've given. But if I was to pick out a few things, I guess we'll start with the importance of understanding the history of all the stakeholders, particularly in this region, and understanding where we've come from. It shouldn't shape where we end up in the future, but it's certainly an important part of being able to influence the stakeholders that are a part of it. So your acknowledgement of that is a key part of your presentation. I guess I've already mentioned that the story of individuals and their community groups from the conservation, and I guess the point that you made around Allan Sefton's contribution earlier in the last decade, and I guess it reflects on what your work is and has been with the Nature Conservation Council. So again, it's about an individual being able to make a significant influence. And the third one, I'm trying to get it down to 3 things: the balance between understanding the truth, so the message that gets out there, so people do understand the truth about what is happening, being able to balance that with the practicalities of technology available, and obviously the economics. One of the challenges for Australia, I think we talked about this last year, was people don't want to pay for things. So the ability to make significant change without actually changing the cost to individuals and the way we operate. People won't understand that this isn't a free ride. Everyone needs to realise that there is a cost associated with it. So if you switch your fuels, there is a cost associated with it at the moment, and the transitional part of that will require. So good information out join me in thanking Pepe for the presentation tonight